Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited about this episode. My guest is Dr. Marc Bubbs. Dr. Bubbs is a naturopathic doctor and consultant performance nutritionist for Canada Basketball and ALTIS. Dr. Bubbs is also the author of the best-selling new book, Peak, the New Science of Performance That is Revolutionizing Sports, as well as a regular contributor to Breaking Muscle and a nutrition advisor board member for Strong Magazine. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hello everyone, super excited to be here with my friend Dr. Marc Bubbs. Dr. Bubbs, how are you?
I'm fantastic, Guillermo. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well, man. It's crazy how, you're in London and I'm out here in Arizona. The world is so small. It amazes me that we are in the paleo community and we're all about trying to live in our most primal ways, whatever that means. But, we can sure use technology to do some amazing things.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, technology allows us to do so many cool things, and then unfortunately there's a flip side to it, but this is definitely the good side. So I appreciate you carving out some time.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, that we can connect and for people that haven't heard your story, I had you as a guest. You were one of my first guests on my podcast around 2.5 years ago.
Nice.
Yeah, so how crazy is that? So why don't you remind my audience, your hero story?
Well, I don't know if it's a hero story, but I'll remind your audience. Many years ago, like a lot of students going into university, I was interested in health, interested in exercise, and for me it was like, okay, how do I find a career that I can use, and this is in the late 90s, thinking nutrition and exercise, and at that time, unfortunately, in medicine there wasn't a lot of focus on nutrition, there wasn't a lot of focus on exercise in general care as well, and so I was lucky enough to take a course. I was at the University of British Columbia, so out in Vancouver in BC, and probably spent maybe a bit too much time up at Whistler than I did in the classroom in the last couple of years there. But they had a tremendous course. It was called Integrated Sciences, and you could take a mixture of all these upper level sciences and get a good range of different biochemistries and kinesiologies and microbiology. And so I really became interested in health, and I just thought, well, how do I apply this to help people and to practice? And so I was a little bit, unfortunately at that time, disillusioned with going into standard medicine. And so, after a few years off, I realized that with being in Canada, as well as similar states in the U.S., having naturopathic medicine as an option, that really resonated with me. And so went back to school to do my degree and then applied what I learned there into sport and performance and helping people out.
And it's so interesting, how I keep saying it, like we all have the same narrative, but our stories differ, how we become disillusioned with this bandage kind of medicine where you suffer from a condition and instead of trying to remove the obstacle to health, we just give you a medication that circumvents the problem. For example, if you have someone that is super stressed or their hormones aren't right, or maybe they don't have very good circadian rhythm entertainment and they're suffering from insomnia. In this way of treating, we go for a sleep medication that basically knocks you out, but it's not, activating the lymphatic system in your brain, and it's not helping you recover and get the benefits from sleep. It's just you're just knocking you out. When the actual problem is lifestyle. But it's just it's so difficult to treat lifestyle in this system that we've created. I'm assuming that you have some experience now with 3 medical models, the United States model, which is a for-profit insurance-based model, the Canadian model, which is a socialist type of model, and now the English model. Do you see a lot of parallels? Do you see that one works better than the other? And always with the supplementation of having a professional that is actually listening to you and then actually investigating that underlying cause of disease.
That's a really interesting question, Guillermo. There's a couple of things that have come up. One recently in the news, and one, a few years ago while I was researching for my book that I stumbled upon. And I'll start with that one. And effectively, it's around the percentage of household spending on ultra processed food. And so this is whether you're in the US, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in the UK, 50%, so half of the grocery bill for everybody's household is spent on stuff that comes in boxes and bags. And so being over here in the UK, in London, I thought, okay, well, let's look at the rest of the European map. And of course, if you're in London, you can hop on a train, and in less than a couple of hours, you're in France, you're in Paris. And you look at the map and you say, geez, I wonder how much they spend on ultra processed food. And of course, the number just plummets from 50% in England to 14% in France. And it's around 13% in Italy and 18% in Spain. And so just this notion around the population's health, when we look at how to keep people healthy, I mean, we can argue around, people can be more plant-based, people can be more paleo or everywhere in between. But this notion of just getting away from processed food is a really huge component of this. And the other piece of information, which I thought was really amazing, was that by 2040, the Spanish will actually surpass the Japanese as the longest living people in the world. And amongst that, I think it's top 5 or top 10. You've got France in there, you've got Luxembourg. So you have a lot of these European countries. And so you start to think, well, what's going on with these countries? And of course, the standard of medical care in these places is very high. We talked about the food quality, the environment, things like that. But one of the things that stood out was actually the U.S., unfortunately, their level of longevity is going to decrease, is one of the biggest drops of all the countries in this next projection. And so I think this is where, when you talk about that model that you just discussed, there's obviously tremendous healthcare in a lot of places in the U.S., but there's also, unfortunately, care that's just probably not up to standard. And of course, that costs a heck of a lot more than it should do.
That's very interesting, because I usually get patients that are going to travel to Europe. They say to me, you know what, when I go to Europe and I have pizza, or if I have bread in France or whatever, I don't get the same, gastrointestinal problems as I do when I get it here in the United States. And it probably comes down to, okay, so you are not driving to work in the morning. You're not stressed out because you have deadlines. You're actually on vacation. You're sleeping a little bit better. You're having fun. Plus, you're not getting bread from your convenience store. You're probably going to a nice restaurant where they're making a ferment, where they're being careful about the ingredients. So it's not just gluten. It's not just bread. It's all of the things around it that are going to affect the way you react to this input.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I think it just becomes, environment is such a powerful stimulus in all this, because, a friend of mine's in a rock band. He's touring around Europe. And if you pull off the side of the highway in Spain, you pull off the side of the highway in America or Canada, I mean, the food options are pretty, let's call them substandard. You pull off the highway in Spain and there's a full cafeteria cooking food made from scratch, chicken breast or fresh vegetables, potatoes. And that's the expected norm. Like, that's what the population is used to. And so it's amazing how, when you're in an environment where things are just that way, you tend to gravitate towards that. Whereas if the environment is set up in a way where, we're going to have more processed food, we're going to have more hyper-palatable, calorie-dense food, sugars, all these types of things. And eventually that just becomes the norm. And so I think that's where, when we look at this sort of obesity problem that we have, not only in Canada and the US and the UK, but, growing across the world, and of course with it, things like type 2 diabetes, is how do we start to create the environment where it's easier for people to make the right decisions? Because at the moment, unfortunately, people are having to really make a lot of tough decisions every single day. And discipline is a finite resource. So at some point, you mentioned stress, if people are stressed and tired and run down, you just can't keep making those decisions day after day and not tripping up at some point.
Super interesting, because smoking has plummeted in the United States since the 60s. Sugar consumption in the United States continues to plummet at levels that, from the 80s. And I remember being in Spain and getting up in the morning and going to get some coffee. And I remember, like, everyone smokes in Spain. You look around, it's like, oh my goodness, everyone's smoking. I imagine that it's the same in France. And like, this baffled me, because the person next to me, they have those really cool orange juice machines where they put the oranges in like this automatic presses it.
It just does it all for you.
Yeah. And like, this dude was like, had a cup of orange juice, opened 2 baggies of sugar, and then poured in the orange juice. And I was like, dude, but he wasn't obese. He probably, has less stress in his life because of the way, society works in Spain. He's probably eating home cooked meals or as close to that, even at a restaurant. In contrast with someone in the United States who is trying to do something healthy for themselves, and they go to a restaurant and they order a salad, and the salad has more calories than if they had chosen the steak. And this actually happened. I was in Toronto with Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villaseñor, and we went to a keg. How classic is that? And we were looking at the menu, and they had all the calorie counts. You could get like a New York strip with some steamed broccoli, and that's 900 calories. But if you chose an entree salad, none of those salads were less than 1,500 calories. And that just baffles me because, we are educated like, red meat is bad for you. You should eat salads. And you end up eating something that is more processed, more calories, and probably more palatable than just a piece of protein with some steamed veggies.
Well, I think you hit it right on the head with when you talk about just the sugar consumption in, Canada, America, the UK. Because again, if we use that European analogy there, like in Spain or France or Italy, I mean, they're just drinking coffee. Maybe there's some milk, maybe there's some cream, but it's just coffee. But if you go into a Starbucks, I mean, you can get a coffee that, just like you mentioned, it can have 1,400 calories because it looks like an ice cream cone.
It tastes like an ice cream cone.
We've managed to sort of, everything that happens sort of gets pulled in that direction. And I think that's, again, an example of like just these environments where, because just like you mentioned, I have clients who are Italian and French, and in the morning they have coffee, but they actually put sugar in their coffee oftentimes, and they'll even have a sweet biscuit or a croissant or something. But when you look at their total caloric intake over the day, it's actually not very high. They don't tend to snack at all between meals, right? They have their 3 square meals more or less and sort of go from there. And if they do snack, these really, calorie dense foods that we tend to maybe go for when we're struggling for energy just isn't part of their sort of norm. So I think those are some pretty big, not to mention the energy expenditure side of things, where the fact that they're just walking and moving a heck of a lot more. And it's amazing how something as simple as that can be the difference between that 300-400 calories a day that leads to either a healthy weight or somebody who's 30-40 pounds overweight.
But it's not sexy, to make a reductionistic assumption as to what is causing this disease processes. It is sexy to say, oh, it's meat, so if you stop eating meat or animal products, that's it, you're going to solve all your problems. Or if you stop eating grains, you're going to solve all your problems. It's really difficult to sit down and actually have a discussion that says, food quality matters, macros matter, but calories do matter. It's not a well-received argument, because we would like to believe that the answer to all of our health problems lies in something simple. The problem is that if you go paleo, if you go vegan, if you go, you name it, you can still have processed foods. You can still have vegan pizza. You can still have paleo brownies. You can still have very calorie dense, super hyper palatable foods that are just going to add to your weight. And then you throw your hands in the air and say, well, I tried that and it didn't work.
Yeah, and I think that's the common theme too. When people go on new diets, like let's say they go on a keto or a paleo diet, they tend to just eliminate a lot of processed food. And so by proxy, the caloric intake drops tremendously, and they see a lot of progress. And similarly, if somebody goes on the other end of the spectrum, if they adopt a vegan diet, typically they're going to be motivated to eat more vegetables. Whether they realize it or not, they're going to start to consume far less processed food as well. And again, they might make a lot of progress. But at some point, it tends to balance itself out. And this is where people kind of get stuck on plateaus. And again, just like you mentioned, this is where they need to just dig a little deeper and try to think it through, whether themselves or with a practitioner. But unfortunately, when most people get stuck, even though they don't realize they're only 10 or 15 degrees off of what they should be doing, they just think, okay, well, 180 degrees, let's do something completely different. I'll try this diet or that diet or a different strategy altogether. And they're sort of failing to grasp the principles that are underpinning all these different dietary strategies.
Tell me about your book. What made you write this book on performance? What was the niche that you were trying to cover?
Yeah, it was great fun, man. Researching the book and getting to connect with a lot of the real leaders on the front lines of performance and research, and a bit like what we're discussing here. I mean, part of it is that elite athletes, professional athletes, Olympic athletes who are at the highest level, they're not trying these exotic exercise regimes, nutrition regimes that we sort of get a lot of press. They're really experts in the fundamentals. I mean, they are applying the fundamentals and rigorously going to work day after day after day. Again, whether it's in the gym, with their nutrition, on the lifestyle front. And so that was really refreshing to see in terms of, when we cover things like sleep and glucose regulation and digestion. This is in the athlete health side of things, which is a kind of a new area. You see in performance now, they started to realize, which, might sound pretty intuitive to some, naturopaths or people who are holistic medicine, but this idea that if you have a healthy athlete, a healthy person, they're going to be a better athlete, right? Because they've got the genetic gifts. If we just keep them healthy, and this was a big study that came out in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, where, frequent illness is incompatible with elite performance. If you're missing training days because you're tired, sick, run down, you just simply can't keep up with the competition. And I think that's a really great lesson for the rest of us who are trying to just perform in our lives and at work and with our families at home, is that, the tortoise beats the hare every single day of the week when it comes to nutrition or exercise, right? If you can commit to that 3 days a week, but actually do it for the 12 months, or do that nutrition change for the full year, rather than just those first 4 or 8 weeks when people tend to come out like gangbusters in the new year, really motivated, but unfortunately that sort of dwindles as the year goes on. That's a powerful thing. So it's just stacking those small gains on top of one another. That's pretty key. And that was a great thing to be able to, flush out with researching for the book. And, we dive into different nutrition strategies, whether you're trying to improve your body composition, whether you're an endurance athlete, team sport, and then walk through things like recovery. And of course, the last section is all on mindset, which I found fascinating, because that's, that space, that 6 inches between the ears is, again, whether you're trying to perform well in your life or you're someone who's looking to push the performance on the athletic side, that's often where the greatest gains are made now. That's where performance teams are trying to mine that potential at the moment.
And I think we're seeing like one of the greatest case studies right in front of our eyes right now with Tom Brady, and the way that he is, deconstructing all the perceived notions of football now. I'm not sure if you follow, but that dude, is still breaking records, and he is doing it by taking care of his body. Like, what a concept, And you see other kids, even at the college level, that have this mentality of like, oh, pain is just whatever that saying is.
Weakness leaving the body.
Yeah,
right?
weakness leaving. Yeah, which is the stupidest thing you can say. And they're breaking their hips, and they're getting injured, and they never made it to the top because they probably had shitty coaching or just really bad advice. And they're getting injured, and they never get to cash in. And then you have this 42-year-old dude who is killing it by doing muscle softening techniques. So it's insane.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting case too, because Tom Brady obviously takes care of his body, and it's great that he puts an emphasis on it. But the irony is, if you read his book TB12, the methods that he's alluding to are not evidence-based in the least, right? And so there's this road between, obviously athletes are also genetically gifted, and
yes.
Usain Bolt will set an Olympic record in China eating the most chicken McNuggets that I think any human's eaten in a 14-day span. So these things need to be taken in context, and I think for all the work that I think with Tom, obviously on the sleep front and taking care of his body with therapy and everything else, and the nice part when you do focus on nutrition is you do tend to eliminate a lot of the processed stuff and get a lot of the good stuff in. But even in that case, if you were to read the TB12 method, I mean, geez, there's a lot of things in there that are sort of, not very evidence-based.
But that's the thing, it's like maybe because he's doing this muscle lengthening, I haven't read into it too much, but it sounds crazy to me. He is not overtraining. And maybe it's not the muscle softening and lengthening techniques, but it's actually getting massages and not going into the gym when you're sore and injuring yourself. That's preserving his ligaments. So who knows what's causing it?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting area because when we look at research around recovery and the use of tech, if we assess your quote unquote recovery, let's say using HRV or something, and in these research studies, they effectively lie. They basically say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to tell this athlete that he's recovering poorly, and then we're going to measure his sprint time. And of course, if you tell them they're recovering poorly, they sprint less quickly. Okay, they take the other group and they tell them they're recovering fantastically well, even though, again, it's not true. And that group runs faster. And so a huge part of all of this, we talk about placebo effect, which, obviously you'd be well versed, this whole mindset piece, because, in medicine or in research, we often say, well, that's just the placebo effect. If you're an elite athlete, you want every single effect you can get your hands on. This effect is going to give you a benefit. And I think that's a huge piece you alluded to a minute ago, is if you have a real belief in this thing that you're doing, so much so that it helps to propel you forward to recover and practice hard. That in itself is a huge, huge win. And I think that's where, all of us as practitioners can learn, because if a client, if you have a certain bias for diet, let's say keto or paleo, and a client comes in and they are really gung-ho about being a vegan, your job isn't to dissuade them to follow the nutrition strategy that they're really motivated for. Your job is to help improve their health and get them to the next bench post. And so I'm always amazed at how that belief factor is just, such a huge, huge win when we talk about marginal gains.
So speaking of recovery and this whole mindset, every once in a while you have these patients, that they are doing everything by the book, and they are the easiest coachable patients, and they're working out 6 times to 7 times a week, and you're looking at them and you're like, dude, you just need to rest. You just need to rest. It is easier to convince someone that is sedentary to start working out than the opposite. If you have someone that is addicted to exercise, it is very difficult to tell them, hey, chill, dude. Especially, when you are having some hormonal dysregulation where, you have this younger female that is maybe now skipping periods, because they are overtraining, or, how do you approach that? How do you do recovery periods? How do you, coach someone to listen to their body so they don't mess up their hormones when they are trying to get to an elite level and their own commitment is kind of getting in the way?
That's a great question, and it's one that does come up often. And, when we talk about this notion of athlete health being so key for performance, now I recently had a renowned sport dietitian on my podcast, and, she'd mentioned that a female's period is actually, when we look at the research now, is actually predictive of better performances at the elite level, right? So losing menses lets us know that, again, in terms of total energy intake, stress, all these things, there's a gap there, right? And so if we're starting to see a client who's missing periods, then this is time to start asking some more questions. Now, the flip side of that is when we think of intensity, we think of overtraining and sort of a recreational elite. Elite athletes push themselves far harder than even our recreational elites, and yet oftentimes don't struggle with these things. And so it's less about the total intensity and more about the volume. So we got a couple things at play here. One of them is just the training plan. So, making sure, if you're really into exercise, investing in a good coach who can lay out a proper plan for you, a plan that progressively overloads and has the right programmed in, deloads and progressions, because that in and of itself, you get a lot of clients who, a bit like you alluded to, you're showing up to the gym, they're performing these training sessions, but the intensity and the duration is the same as it was, 3 months ago. And so the body's adapted to that. So the amount of adaptation is very low, but there's still this nervous system stress. And of course, the last piece when we look at this is around the total energy that's going in, because oftentimes, clients, if they're training hard and they're, following a certain regime, they often want to improve their performance in the gym, but they also want to look better as well, right? They probably want to get leaner and these types of things. And so anytime you're in a caloric deficit, right, you need to be in a caloric deficit to lose weight, but when you're in a caloric deficit, your metabolism is going to start to slow a little bit. If you train frequently, train often, long duration sessions, it's also going to start to slow metabolism as the body protects itself. And so typically these clients are trying to lose weight too quickly. And so the energy that's going in, the amount of calories that they're consuming isn't sufficient to meet the demands of what they're trying to do in the gym. And so this is called low energy availability, right? There's not enough fuel on board. And the nuance here is that it's if you're a new athlete, or let's say, in the general public, you have some 20 or 30 pounds to lose. That's a different scenario than the client who has sort of 8 or 10 pounds to lose and is actually training quite hard and the sessions are quite intense. Because when we look at the fuels that need to go in, if you're going to do a heavy glycolytic session and you're a female athlete, around carbohydrate intake, we do need to make sure that, we're consuming sufficient, whether it's pre, post, or both, to achieve that. And I think it's kind of eye-opening when we look at research in bodybuilders, elite female bodybuilders. This was one done in the UK, so all the ones who performed at the highest level and medaled in their weight classes. They were consuming about 4 grams per kilogram body weight of carbohydrate. And so you think, geez, that's a heck of a lot more than a lot of female recreational elites are trying to consume, right? I mean, low carb diets can be tremendously effective for weight loss, but the easiest heuristic to sort of follow is the more elite you get, or the more fit you get, or the more intense your sessions, then this is where you need to start shifting that balance a little bit so you can actually fuel your sessions, right? Because if you fuel your sessions adequately, you can then get the intensity where you want it to in the session and create that adaptation. So it can be a tricky one for folks, because I think at the beginning, a lot of people get a lot of progress by dropping carbohydrate intake. But in general, as your fitness increases, that's where you want to start thinking about how much carbohydrate you're taking in, because if that total energy isn't sufficient, then this is where, they call it circling the drain, where you're effectively trying to consume fewer and fewer calories to lose weight. You're trying to train more and more to lose weight. But as you do this, the nervous system stress is so high that the body's really trying to protect itself and hold on as best it can.
I want you to expand, and I don't know if, I'm putting you on the spot. What would be the evolutionary advantage for this downregulation of hormones?
Well, I think from an evolutionary standpoint, the body's always trying to, procreation was always the number one priority, right? And so trying to conserve energy for essential processes in the body is job number one. And so, you might think that having the best time in your CrossFit WOD is important to you, and maybe it is, but, from an evolutionary standpoint, if we start to have all of these intense sessions without adequate recovery or without adequate caloric intake, the body's going to start to slow metabolism to protect those functions. And so if you do see, menstrual cycle changing or missing menstrual cycles, this is a warning sign that lets you know that your training plan is off, your nutrition's off, lifestyle factors like sleep or stress management. These are things that we need to kind of take into consideration, because, as I mentioned before, Susan Kleiner was the sport dietitian I'm referring to. Her work showing that at the elite level, if you maintain menstrual function, you perform better than other endurance athletes. And classically, this is a huge finding, because classically we would say, well, you're an endurance athlete, you're female, of course you're going to lose your period when you get to this level. But now we see that's not the case. And so that's an important one to remember, and for clinicians to remember as well, because I think sometimes as clinicians, you start to run hormone tests and you see low levels of certain hormones, and we start to make inferences. But if you were to look at a bodybuilding competition, and at again the world's best on the stage, who look the best and are very muscular and very lean, all of them would have low testosterone and high cortisol, right?
Yeah.
but they're not necessarily having a problem. And so when we look at some of the hormones, the specificity is good, but things like free testosterone, total testosterone, these things are only about 26% sensitive for what we call non-functional overreaching, which is that initial stage before you'd even get to overtraining. And so we can't really hang our hat on running a cortisol test or a testosterone test to be able to tell us the whole story about whether an athlete's having problems or not. It's part of the picture, and certainly you can run some of these tests, but it's important to consider that. And it's also important to consider that there's seasonal variations in these tests. So if you start running hormone tests in June and then comparing them to November, that's, we're going to have changes in those readings as well.
Just to bring it back, I do see a lot of this evolutionary mechanism to where, your hormones start becoming dysregulated, especially around women that are trying to do intermittent fasting. It is a flaw of maybe some of the messages that we put out, because I benefit greatly from intermittent fasting. I pretty much do intermittent fasting, 26 days out of the month with a, 16-hour, 8-hour window for eating. But then I have patients, who haven't, been seen before. They come into the office and they're like, I've been trying to do intermittent fasting. I've been trying to work out more. Nothing has changed. And just adding a little bit of calories, not even that much, maybe just a protein shake in the morning is enough to kind of rebalance that, oh shit, mechanism of I'm going to have to downregulate your thyroid in order for you to just sit down and chill for a second. And then now the metabolism starts working better, and now they start losing weight effortlessly. But that's very specific for women, because most of the guys that are doing intermittent fasting benefit tremendously. And again, it's like a bank account. How many calories do you need as a guy to continue that reproductive cycle? How many calories do you need as a girl to continue that reproductive cycle? And you're talking about 150, 200 calories for a guy, and millions of calories in order for a woman to 3D print a baby. So,
yeah, I mean, I think one thing that people forget, Guillermo, is that, if you're, let's say, slightly overweight, I mean, 60 to 65% of all the calories you burn is your metabolic rate, right? It's your resting metabolic rate. So just the amount of energy we need to pump your heart and ventilate your lungs. And so as you try to diet too aggressively, so the steeper you drop calories, the more likely you are to burn off muscle mass, which tends to contribute to that nice drop initially that we see on the scale that people tend to like, because a lot of it's actually muscle and water and glycogen, but it'll tend to flatten out as they go along. But that 60, 65%, I mean, that's just your metabolic rate. If you keep that healthy, that's a huge, huge component that you're burning. I mean, even if you go into the gym, I mean, that's 5 or 10% from what you do in the gym. And so such an important point, just as you mentioned, that, whether it's getting your sleep or this idea of low energy availability, you're not consuming enough. We actually feed you more. The metabolism can get to where it needs to be. And now you start getting leaner and feeling better and having more energy. And for a lot of people, it's like, it's very counterintuitive, right? Because they tend to still have that mindset of, if I want to lose weight, my plate's got to shrink and there's got to be less stuff on my plate for me to lose weight. Where, as you know, obviously, you can increase the amount of food on your plate and still have the caloric density go down.
My favorite example is, it's like a baked potato. You put a potato in the oven and you pull it out of the oven, you eat it. It's not very tasty. But if you add butter to it, now you're increasing calories and it's a little bit easier to eat. And if you add bacon or if you add sour cream, you can continue adding things and it becomes more calorie dense and equally as filling as just a plain potato, So if you want to increase the amount of volume, you gotta actually do less processed foods. It is more difficult to overeat just potatoes. There's a book called The Potato Hack, than adding more stuff and making it more complicated. So the less palatable the food is, the more filling and the more voluminous it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's just, having all that variety can definitely impact. And, just circling back to what you mentioned before around, hormones, I think that's another one where, males and females, but, we see low testosterone amongst folks these days who are, stressed and overtraining potentially and not getting enough sleep. And again, sleep is just such an easy win for all these things. I mean, if you're an athlete, getting more sleep is going to improve things like reaction time, sprint speed, skill in your sport, reduces things like pain tolerance and injury risk. So, it's one of those, we talked about the unsexy things. I mean, even when we look at elite athletes, so Olympic athletes compared to age and sex match controls in the general population still get less sleep and more fragmented sleep. So even though we know that this is important, it's still tough to get the elites to do it. So, as practitioners, we're always trying to find out, how do we get people to actually do the things that are the easy wins, right? How do we make things that seem sort of boring sexy so that we can actually get the gains that we want? And I think this is one where, whether it's making sure you get to that at least 7 hours, right, from National Sleep Foundation, 7 to 9 hours, or start adding some naps in on the weekends or wherever you can to think about your weekly total sleep time. But that's just such a huge component. When you ask all these, I interviewed folks like Dr. Shona Halson, Australian Institute of Sport, expert in recovery for my book. And, for her, especially for recreational elite, sleep is far and away the number one place to go for recovery. And I think, we all get busy and life's, there's fun bits of life and there's too many stresses and all these types of things. But I think we got to always circle back and say, okay, what are the big rocks? What are the things that can really move the needle? And let's make sure we're ticking those off, because, if you're getting 6 hours or 5.5 and trying to hit those performance gains, it's going to be really difficult in the long run.
So how do you track recovery or your exertion? Do you use HRV?
So with clients, depending on the client, there's a lot of different metrics that you can use. I think it's definitely one of those scenarios where we can get high tech or we can go low tech, right? So when we look at things like daily wellness questionnaires, which is basically you rating yourself on a scale of 1 to 5, and things like muscle soreness and sleep and stress, and pound for pound, that stacks up pretty well against the best technology in the world in terms of recovery, right? So we have this kind of lower fidelity, subjective questionnaire that we can apply. And then we have things like, HRV or Omega Wave. We'll stick with HRV because that tends to be more popular. And that can provide us with a lot of insight. But if you're a recreational client who's sometimes going to be, who's very into this, you might make inferences that are not true, right? You might start to overinterpret the data that's coming out. And so you do need to have a lot of longitudinal data to start to inform, what you're doing best. So if folks are into that, there's obviously a lot of great resources. I mean, we touch into it in the recovery chapter in the book, a lot of Andrew Flatt's work, who specializes in HRV research. But I think an easy way, you wake up in the morning, your heart rate's 10 beats higher than it normally is. Hey, maybe we got to think about what we're doing in the gym today, or nutrition, etc. Or on exertion's a big one. You're going for that run. We probably have a lot of endurance athletes or runners listening in. And on a run where you typically have a heart rate of, let's say, 130, 140, 150, now all of a sudden your heart beats 15 or 20 beats higher. That's another indication that the body's under stress. So, mood is another one. This is really common as well, catching things like colds or flus. So I think people struggle with kind of picking up on those things. And because I'm sure you deal with a lot of type A personalities as well. People tend to want to just go, I can push through this, I can get out. And that's when I think you alluded to previously, like training smart is important, right? Like when you train hard, but don't just go out and put in a hard session when really it's going to then put you over the edge into what we call this non-functional overreaching. And now you've got a cold, and that cold's going to last 2 weeks. And now we've just missed 10 training sessions. So rather than sacrificing one training session to get well, you've tried to push through and you've cost yourself 8, 9, 10 training sessions. And that's the mentality that, unfortunately, it's tougher for people to kind of adopt because we want to just be kind of strong and push through. But, you got to think of it a bit like investments of longer term versus just, the payout, the next day or the end of the week.
Just thinking about, all these different strategies, it's really funny whenever I log into social media and people are talking about like using bicarb, to reduce lactic acid and things like that. And I'm like, man, most of these people maybe don't even have enough loading, or they're not training hard enough for this to make any sense. But we are so enamored with this technologies and things like that. It is fascinating to see people using this like super crazy advanced ways of buffering when they haven't even earned it, so it is always really funny to see things like that. What about periodization? I've heard Greg Everett, used to recommend women having like during their cycle be like an offload week. So you train hard for 3 weeks and then you do an offloading week, the week of your cycle. And that helps you with like during that off week, you can do mobility, you can do technique and not really push yourself and then be ready for your advancing your gains after that load off week. Do you do any of that periodization? When do you think people need to start thinking about that?
It's another great question. And it's one where I think it always starts with your context. If you're a professional sprinter, female sprinter, I mean, you can't control when the national championships are or when the Olympics are, right? I mean, you might be having your period that week. And so having strategies in place to be able to create a certain level of norm is important because we don't want to now be overreacting or induce, mental stresses because this is taking place, right? Whereas if you, as you mentioned, if you're a recreational athlete and you have more control over your schedule and there aren't these events that are taking place, then potentially that is a nice strategy, right? You can work more. If you're not feeling as good, you can work more around things on that front. So, I think that's one where you got to start with your context first and start with what you're trying to achieve. And then, as I mentioned before, I mean, get your training plan right. So find someone, a professional who can build out a training plan for you. And on the nutrition front, there's two ends of the barbell. I mean, there's the people who need to lose a lot of weight that unfortunately are just over consuming. And that's where low carb approaches or dropping caloric intake significantly can be really beneficial. But the ones who are maybe, listening in here that you're alluding to are the kind of, fit female athletes who are trying to get a little bit leaner and have that sort of 10 or 12 pounds to lose or need to get leaner. And more times than not, they're not eating enough, which is weird to say, probably weird for them to think about, but they need to fuel them more because they tend to often be in the state of low energy availability. And I recently, Jen Saigo is a prominent sport dietitian up here in Toronto, works with a lot of sprinters, works with the Raptors, and she did some work in elite sprinters, female sprinters. And, we often think of not consuming enough calories more with endurance athletes and things like that. But even in her cohort of sprinters, this was flagging up more frequently than suspected. And so a low carb diet is such a good heuristic for people who are overweight that it's easier for folks to confuse that for when they're sort of fitter, that if they're struggling to lose weight, they're just going to drop carbohydrate.
There's a lot of buzz about rehydration and the importance of salt. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, hydration is very important. I mean, we see, you talked HRV a minute ago. When you have HRV measures, I mean, if you're dehydrated, you'll see changes in HRV. So, hydration is important. You're affecting blood volume. And so, you definitely want to stay hydrated. And I think that's where, if you consume more real food, if you consume more animal protein or vegetable protein, but vegetables as well and forms of carbohydrate, you're going to bring on board more water with those things as well, on top of what you consume as a beverage, as you're drinking, right? And I think that's another one where we talk about, there's a beverage hydration index, and things like Diet Coke and, non-alcoholic beer are actually more hydrating than water. And so again, it can be a bit confusing for folks because it's like, wait a minute. And that's not to say that you shouldn't drink water, but again, if we're trying to achieve certain hydration, then the concentration of the fluid you're drinking matters. And so this is where, whether it's mineral waters or adding, pinches of sea salt to your water to be able to take it in more effectively, because, I'm sure you've had some clients, Guillermo, that, drink the 4 liters of water a day, but they're peeing all day long. And so effectively we're losing sodium instead of gaining it. And this is where, we got to have a more targeted strategy.
People don't understand that processed foods have so much salt. Okay. And when you're going from like a processed food diet to a more vegan or paleo or, a less processed, you are losing so much sodium from your diet. And I've had patients that had night and day changes in their energy, in their health, just by adding some electrolytes, daily. And, it's sometimes it's hit or miss, but with those patients that just radically changed, it's like, I've been listening to your show, or I've been, following so-and-so, and I've lost a lot of weight, but I need like the next push or the next, I need to reach the next summit, and you look at their diet and again, they're consuming less processed foods, and you notice that maybe their salt intake is gone, and now you add a little bit of salt, a little bit of potassium, a little bit of magnesium, and those electrolytes just change their lives, and it's like a night and day when it comes to energy, and that is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one where, the more you're sweating, the more you're losing. Absolutely. Getting electrolytes right is key. And as you mentioned, whether it's, adding some sea salt or being very liberal, I think that's another one where if people eat, quote unquote, more clean, and they're used to the narrative of not adding salt to food, then all of a sudden it's easy to get pretty low. And so, yeah, that's a super, super key. And, it's one where even if you're running a marathon and you cramp up, I mean, just having a big dose of salt at that time for some people can be the trick right there with the cramping. So yeah, hugely, hugely important for sure.
Have you been following the Nike Under 2?
Yes. Yeah.
Any comments on that? Because that guy was keto, wasn't it? No, he was not keto. Dr. C, if you're listening, he was fueling with carbohydrates.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. So Andy Jones, who's a sports scientist, a prominent sports scientist in the UK, who's doing all the work for the Breaking 2. I mean, this is a great example of even sub-elite versus elite. So when they did the initial Breaking 2, I think he told a story where he had a friend who was a journalist or something, and they were a really good recreational marathoner. And so because he had his lab all set up to test these pros, his friend, the journalist, came in and got himself tested up for his VO2 max and did the treadmill test, where they keep increasing the incline on the treadmill, and, eventually you have to tap out because you can't keep running that fast. And, this guy who was elite for recreational, he tapped out about 17 kilometers an hour. So in come the elites. The elites warm up at 17 kilometers an hour, right? So we're not even talking about the same kind of human.
Yeah.
And yet when we say, well, this is what Kipchoge takes to fuel his marathon.
Or these are the shoes that he wears.
Well, but the fueling, I mean, he runs the marathon in 2 hours. You run it in 4 hours, and we're going to fuel you with the same amount of carbohydrate. I mean, unfortunately, this type of, as you mentioned, reductionist direct translation happens all the time. And people who train for marathons, and this is a tragedy, trying to lose weight, they run for 6 months, they don't get any leaner. They increase their energy expenditure, 2, 3, fourfold, and still don't lose very much weight. And this is when you absolutely know you've got the wrong fueling strategy, right? When you're increasing your energy expenditure that much and the waistline's not moving, that's when it's, you need to look in a different direction. And I think that, it's a great example, the breaking two. I mean, these people are running men and women. I mean, you wouldn't even be able to run 100 meters at that speed and they're running for 2 hours.
And all of this, translates and it makes it down to, low-level beings like me. I remember back in the 2000s when I was running long distance, which I sucked at. I am not built for long distance. And I remember running a 10K in Miami. And the night before the 10K, we went to a pasta place and I carbo loaded. Like, it took me forever to run it. It's so stupid. We think, but that's what the elites do. Well, you're not elite. So last year, the company, my company, we did one of those mud runs. And,
oh, nice.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, it's a 5K. I'm pretty fit to run a 5K. I didn't train. My food intake was the same as any other day. And I am ready that if the shit hits the fan, I can jump over some fences and climb a couple of walls.
There you go. When the zombies come, right?
Yeah, I didn't carbo load. I didn't do anything different. I continued doing my squat, my deadlift, my overhead press. I do like row 10 minutes before my sessions. And that's all it took for me to have this acute event where it's just a 5K. Sure, I was a little bit sore that if I had trained more, but I didn't have to change my fueling strategy or anything because I'm prepared. If I wanted to go for a record, it would be completely different training strategy. But it's just funny, to remember those days when I was running long distance and I was doing like the stupidest things, thinking that it was going to improve my performance. And it might have helped maybe half a second, but it's just completely unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all fall into that camp, right? It's like, start doing strategies that are, and it's just perpetuated as well, right? Because just like you mentioned, a 5K, hey, yeah, we should be able to just fuel for that like we normally would and get out there. And, it's a great distance to run and bang it out.
So last question, this is so interesting. What do you think about tracking devices, electronic devices, like your Apple Watch, your Oura Rings and things like that?
I think we're in a really interesting time because there's so much amazing technology we have that can give us a lot of amazing insights. I also think that in general, people aren't very good at understanding what their body's feeling and how they're just that subjective wellness, right? So sometimes people, tracking devices can be tremendous, right? If you're using them appropriately. But if you're the type of person who's always tracking, who runs every single run with a heart rate monitor, I think for those people, there's probably a lot of benefit for you to scrap that for a little bit and just go with some intuition, right? Just see what your body can do. See if you can sense that pushing and pulling. And on the flip side, if you're someone who never runs with any technology, who doesn't like to use technology, who thinks that, it's too techy or doesn't work for you, I think that's where they can get a lot of insight as well, right? So in terms of whether it's heart rate or recovery or these types of things. So I think whatever end of the spectrum that you fall, I think it's important for you to dip back into the other side to be able to get some perspective. Because oftentimes the clients that I see in practice, if they're on the technology side, they've gone so far down the rabbit hole. It's like, again, we've missed some of these big buckets, these fundamentals, right? Chasing these sort of marginal gains. And that's because sometimes we can get distracted with some of the technology. So again, used appropriately can be tremendous, but I think like anything, you want to be flexible. You want to be able to go both ways. If your technology runs out on you and you're in a competition, I sure as heck hope you can keep going and have a strategy in place, and you're not just gonna, freak out that you don't have this information. And so, yeah, it's a really cool time because we do have a lot at our disposal. But I think we got to make sure that we're always coming back to being able to use our intuition, and that comes as well for things like meditation apps and those types of things. Again, they can be great, but hey, can we do some of that stuff without using the technology? Can we get away from technology a little bit? I think is pretty valuable as well.
I think that's the biggest thing, and I would add, get yourself out of your head and have someone objectively look at your own data, because that's, that's when you learn the most, just keeping those logs and you analyzing them and you're not advancing. Well, if you're not advancing anymore, it's time for you to find someone that can help you advance.
100%. Well said.
So, how can people get a hold of you? How can people reach out? What's your podcast?
Yeah, man. Well, listen, thanks so much for having me on the show. It was, always great fun to reconnect. I spent the last couple of years researching and writing this book called Peak, The New Science of Athletic Performance That's Revolutionizing Sports. We had a nice little run there, number one on Audible in the U.S. and on Amazon in Canada and the U.S. and the U.K. So people are interested in taking a deeper dive and seeing what, these performance staffs and people in the front lines are doing and these fundamentals that all of us can do to impact our performance. And you can check that out. If you want to keep in touch with me, at Dr. Bubbs, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I got a funny last name, so it's easy to find me. And then the podcast is the Performance Nutrition Podcast. So if you're looking to, upgrade your performance, then check us out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Any conferences, any speaking engagements?
We're working on the 2020 schedule coming up, but still hammering that out. So should know in the next month or so. So yeah, drbubbs.com if you want to check that out.
Awesome. It's always a pleasure talking to you, just a wealth of information. And, I can't wait to have you back in, a couple of months so you can update us on all your research and all your experiments.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Guillermo. And, enjoy the sun over there. I'm a little bit jealous.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you so much.
All right, bud.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.